All right, YouTube, it's time to talk about the genuine possibility of a coming world struggle. I speak here, you may be aware of the fact that most of the large, consequential economies of the world right now are going downhill. That's part of it. That certainly figures into what I'm going to talk about here. You're probably aware, of course, that large parts of the less developed world, specifically the Middle East, now in Indonesia as well, are being racked by groups which might be thought of as pan nationalist, reactionary, theocratic, in some cases, secular fronts attempting to rise up. Various, what we term in the modern age, militant groups, which really they're just rebels. They're no different than any of the groups which rose up in the interwar period in Europe between the First and Second World War. And right now we're going through a cycle that is roughly akin to the 1930s. I do expect the economic downturn that is currently hitting the world. China, for the fourth day in a row, has been off significantly. It's begun to affect U.S. markets. It's affecting the rest of Asia. It's affecting Europe. The growth of the one mass producing economy in the world that actually has enough output to prop up most of the rest of the economies that need to import a lot of cheap shit. That economy is failing. There's also something with the Swiss banks declaring that China's export numbers don't add up and may be vastly overestimated, which is just going to bring them more misery. I would like to point out, before I get into the meat and bones of this video, the nation of China is still pumping artificially its economy. This is akin to if a person had massive bleeding wounds. They're just bleeding out, and you keep giving them transfusions but don't actually clog the wound up because there's no way for you to do that. You can pump them as long as you want, but they're going to continue to deflate. That's what the Chinese economy is doing. The government of China is still pumping money, billions and billions of dollars a day, into their stock market, into their economy at large. It's not working. They've collapsed as badly in the last week as they did previously, to the same low level that they were at before, after making very meager gains when it became clear that their growth is still falling. It's going to continue to fall. The game may be over for China because it may end up racking the world markets. I would like to point out 5 truths that play directly into my theory about the coming struggle that this world is going to go through. Now, there are ways out of this. One possibility is the return to a very traditionalist, almost reactionary form of government in the United States and Europe. This could fend off the inevitable for a few generations, maybe. But there's really no precedent for escaping the 4-generational cycle. I can't remember the name of the philosophers. I will dig it up and put a link in the description, though, who developed a theory about the sort of 4 generations that cycle through the results of those generations. I believe it operates upon a larger framework. That is, that it doesn't just have to do with the generations and their sort of mood towards the world and interactions with past generations. So much as it affects politics, it affects society at large, it affects everything, because everything, again, feeds into the possibility of war, how countries interact with one another, diplomacy and things like that. The way in which these things works is anthropic, because they're anthropic ideas. War is a man-made concept. Therefore, it is directly impacted by this generational cycle. I encourage you strongly. I've released an edition of the same, which is obviously less expensive than the others, of Wolf Sorensen's Voice of Our Ancestors. Read it. It's only 32 pages long. It's not a particularly impressively long work. It's basically a political manifesto. He billed it as a poem at the time. This is the pen name of Frithjof Fischer, who was briefly considered to be possibly Heinrich Himmler. We now know this isn't actually the case. He was an earlier sort of Bavarian days, 30s era philosopher. The work's from 35. And it will show you the mindset of the moral traditionalist in Europe prior to the Second World War, prior, in fact, to the rise of the Nazi Party. I would point out that the counterpart to this, of course, was the Communist Party. We see this interplay at work right now here in the United States. We see it at work within Europe. We see increasingly there are groups that are more and more far to the left, openly embracing socialism, some aspects of communism. The rest of them are moving steadily to what we would perceive of as the right, which I would say is just the traditionalist. They're forming basically strong-arm gangs in order to protect people from refugees or beat on refugees or arm themselves against some perceived tyrannical force. It's exactly the same as what happened in the 30s. It happened here in the United States too, by the way. There were protests and riots here, the same as there were in Europe. They continued throughout the Second World War. It wasn't just a European thing. The 5 truths are this, and I've got them listed so that I can say these in as clear a way as possible. It's fairly rare that I do that on a video, that I actually have like a notepad open. But I'm going to read through them and describe them in some detail. And these are 5 things that people need to know if they're going to properly interpret what's going on in the world now, what could, not necessarily will, but precedents included, probably you would think would happen in the near future, in the next decade or so. These are 5 things people must keep in mind. Number 1, the atomic era and digital era are the same thing. Most of the time when you talk to people who know anything about politics or sociology, they'll say, well, through the sort of the 80s, kind of into the 90s, we were in the atomic era, you know, boom, boom, boom. They're setting off nuclear weapons, and, you know, everything was kind of like nifty 50s, but, you know, we had these big weapons that could suddenly destroy everything in their path. This changed the paradigm of how humanity operated. It changed the way war was fought. That was the atomic era. And then around the time of the fall of the USSR, coincidentally linked with the rise of the information culture of the internet, now we're in the digital age. We're in the post-atomic age. I argue this is not the case. We're just in the atomic age. Or rather, the atomic age should instead be called the age of technology. And we're still in it. We're revving up the engines and increasingly building newer and better technology. What use is much of that technology actually put towards? What do we actually do with that technology? Yes, we've made leaps and bounds since 1945 in medicine, obviously. We've made leaps and bounds in transportation. We've made leaps and bounds in everything. What's the one thing we haven't really made leaps and bounds in? Diplomacy. It's no more effective now than it was then. It's just as bureaucratic. It's just as strangulated. Nations still primarily serve their own interests. I should say the interests of a moneyed political elite and their fiscal backers within corporations and banks, multinational banks. Nothing has changed on that platform. Another large amount of technological progress has gone into weaponry. That is, yes, we had atomic weapons in the 40s. Now we have a much larger number of much larger nuclear systems. We have drones that can kill people halfway across the world in the blink of an eye. We have all sorts of stuff. We have mother of all bombs, father of all bombs. We have all these wonderful weapons. They're supposedly wonderful. Really, though, the mentality of the world diplomatically is still locked in World War I. It never got past that. We need to first understand this fact and understand that the atomic age and the digital age are just kind of variants of the same exact thing. Going forward to the rest of these, we need to keep that in mind, because we've got to understand diplomacy didn't change. The consciousness of the masses changed. That is, people can communicate with others in other countries very easily. And you would think that this amount of exposure to other cultures would cause all members of these said cultures to be more tolerant of one another, to be less jingoistic, to be more conscious of the fact that there are living, breathing civilian human beings in all of these countries that really just want to be left alone. That hasn't actually happened, though. If anything, the information transfer of the internet has made people more warlike, more openly hostile towards one another. Unlike people like Chris Christie or Marco Rubio or Ben Carson, or certainly Hillary Clinton, I wouldn't chalk this up to, oh, this terrible online anonymity. Because even in forums where anonymity isn't there, it's exactly the same. It has nothing to do with that. They're just using that as a police state grab, let's face it. Number two, such struggles, the coming struggle, World War II, whatever you're talking about, are preceded by mass nostalgia, whether the nostalgia is for a real past or a fabricated or idealistic one. Again, read Voice of Our Ancestors. He's talking about Snow White and how it's about Rome invading the Germanic lands and conquering it with Christianity and the cult of Sinai, which is Judaism, of course. It doesn't even matter if, and this is especially important if the youth is showing nostalgia. Everyone expects somebody who's 70, 80 years old to look back and say, oh, it was better when I was a kid. Kids these days, things aren't the same as they used to be. We expect that. That's a given. Everyone knows that's going to happen. Doesn't even matter what culture it is. If there's any change at all, people are going to look back with nostalgia. When you begin to see nostalgia, though, in the youth, that's when it's a potential warning sign. Specifically, what has happened in the Western world is that people my age and younger, we're talking the 35 and unders here, people a little bit older, a little bit younger, down into their tweens, look back at the past. I mean, I've seen people who claim to be like 9, 10 years old talking about how great Victorian era music is, talking about how they like, documentaries about the Titanic and stuff like that. They look back at the past age. They see the stuff that's there in film or in music or whatever, and they're nostalgic for it. They never lived through it. The life that they perceive of now as being so shitty, lacking opportunity, a world that is cruel and unjust, government that is cruel and unjust, people that are cold, distant, and uncaring. The problems that they perceive in the world has warped and distorted their view of reality, such that they look back at a time they themselves never actually witnessed, based solely on recollections of it from the time that are idealistic anyway, even if they're more or less kind of accurate, kind of documentary material. You would think of 30s, 40s era documentaries. Oftentimes the documentaries, they're very ethnocentric, regardless of where they were made. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the white world, by the way. They look back at these times and say, man, it must have been so much better back then. Even I will admit, I'm nostalgic for the 1980s. I look back at the sort of music, the sort of films, the sort of atmosphere I perceive by imbibing material from the 1980s. I feel nostalgic. Now, I was born in 1988, so I never really, I wasn't conscious of the world around me until the very, very end of the 1980s, into the early days of the 90s. I'm sort of a Clinton baby. But I'm nostalgic for some of the stuff, especially from the early 80s and the late 70s too. That period of time. When you begin seeing this gain more fervor, though, among the youth, not just, well, I like music from the 60s, this hippie music's pretty good, but more of an, I want to dress that way, I want to think that way, man, if I had a time machine, I'd be gone, fuck this gay earth. When you see that mentality among the youth, you know that this is a telling sign that something is seriously wrong. These are people that would be, all American, well, this country's great. They don't feel that way. And people feel the same regardless of where in the world they are. You see it all around the world. Everywhere. Can you think of a single location where the youth is saying, life is great, I have so many possibilities, jobs are everywhere, we're at peace, government's fine, yeah, the government's all right, maybe a little quirky sometimes, but it's all right. No. Nobody's saying that. There's nobody under 50 or 60 years old in the whole fucking world that believes that. In fact, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a single person on the face of the earth at this point who thinks that any government in the world is good. Any culture is as stable as it was at some golden age in the past, wherever they happen to locate that as being. This same feeling of social alienation and fiscal alienation, too, I would say, preceded the Second World War. The only difference, of course, during the Second World War, we didn't have nuclear weapons. That's kind of the fucking problem. That's why I choose to believe man is on borrowed time. Number 3, such struggles arise not spontaneously. They may appear to be so, though, but because of the ignorance of a political class which has been in power too long. In all such cases, World War I, what causes this? People within elite circles with power over militaries and academia got bent out of shape that one dude got assassinated, and because of a tangled web of alliances that was no less convoluted than their own way of thinking with regards to governance, because of this convolution, World War I erupts. People go through World War I, lots of people die, everyone says, we'll never do it again. And then World War II happens not long after because they didn't learn anything from it. They learned absolutely nothing. The same elite class that had been in power in World War I merely changed forms. The same people had money because the same people made money making all the bullets and tanks and so forth. You had some newcomers, a few of the old guard died off. We've seen this time and time again, but basically it was the same multinational companies, the same multinational billionaire banks that still exist today, the same old money families, and the same upstarts that those same old money families, they just basically adopt them. You become a multi-billionaire and get political connections and do all these things. You're going to get adopted by the Rothschilds or something like that, and they're going to be buddy-buddy and inviting you to their white tie events. That's the way that the world works. It predicated the First World War. It directly led to the Second World War. The Treaty of Versailles allowed the National Socialists to rise to power. Only the instability within Germany itself proper at the time even allowed these fringe ideologies to exist. Nobody would have voted for the communists or the Nazis if Germany had been wealthy and they had just, been drinking beer all day. Never would have happened. People would have voted for the Social Democrats or for the Republicans there at the time, who they didn't want war. they didn't even really care about maintaining their military at that point. That's another symptom. You have leaders that are grossly out of touch with the people to the point where even people who generally supported them prior say, what the hell are they thinking? People said it then, people say it now. It's the same exact thing as when we were in the 1930s, minus we're not in a Great Depression, at least not yet. 4, such struggles involve and are caused by the alienation of traditionalists, kind of hand in hand with number 2 here. When people who have what are considered traditional values, moralists, reactionary, whatever, again, whether they're legitimate or not, whether they're based on a real tradition or some perceived fake tradition that nonetheless has gained favor among a segment of the population. That is when hell breaks loose. Now, the alienation can go on for a while, and it's just, it pisses people off, but ultimately nobody really gives a damn because, you got the pendulum politics going back and forth. This is why I say we'll be lucky if Trump becomes the next president. Because most of the people that feel socially alienated that aren't alienated because they're communists or something, they'll be just fine. They'll go back to acting as normal. They'll go back to eating their apple pie if Trump is nominated. If not, if somebody like Bernie or Hillary is nominated or some other insider or somebody too far to the left, they'll go apeshit. You'll see more militias. People will certainly purchase more firearms. You'll see more protests. You'll see more problems in this country. Crime will probably start rising again for the first time in 30 years, or 25 years, that is. When people who have strong moral traditions, especially the youth, are alienated, made to feel lesser because they feel that some sort of past way of thinking is superior to the way of thinking that is being conducted now, that's when people start joining militant groups. I think we're seeing this in the Middle East. People are ignoring the fact that the spread of sort of the multinational globalism into some of these parts of the Middle East really has propped up a lot of these militants. ISIS didn't just spontaneously come into existence simply because there was a power vacuum. You can't exploit a power vacuum unless your message is reaching people. You need recruits. Where did ISIS find these recruits? Old guard Islamists from sort of the 70s and 80s era, back when it was, do jihad for Ronald Reagan and kill some commies. These people now take up arms, along with, losing my voice here, along with the disaffected youth. And that's the other part. You see a lot of tech literate youths going into groups like ISIS. Why? Why would they abandon their trust fund and their Pokemon cards and their iPhones and their warm bed? Why would they abandon all of these things to go grow a beard, go way overseas to a place they've never been, to join a religion that, they've half the time probably haven't even studied, to go fight and potentially die? Why would they do this? Is it because of violent video games? Is it because their parents didn't raise them right? No, it's because they can feel completely socially alienated by the government. The same thing that you see here in this country, by the way, when people are flocking to a rally held by a self-proclaimed socialist, the people there feel alienated by the establishment. When people flock to rallies held by somebody who says, fuck immigrants, we're going to build a border wall along the Mexican border, it's because they feel socially alienated. The only difference between these groups, that is, the people joining actual militant uprisings around the world, or militias or whatever, and those that are going to these rallies, is that the latter are nonviolent individuals. They're not going to take up arms at a moment's notice simply because they feel bad about their lives. They do, but they still see a possibility of reform. If you don't give them a reformer, and the problem is, of course, the false dichotomy that has been created artificially means you're only going to be able to reform things for one of these halves at a time. There's the danger zone. You're going to piss somebody off regardless of what happens. Unless you give them some sort of reformer who can unite your nation. This is the case whether you're talking about Europe with the refugees there, the United States with worries about ISIS and so forth here. The Middle East, oddly enough, the Middle East that's being ripped apart by civil wars and militants, unless you give them some sort of reformer, real or imagined, somebody charismatic enough to pass for one, or somebody who actually is a well-meaning reformer, it doesn't really matter which you choose, as long as they're effective, they will begin to become more socially alienated. And these are the people that are going to be running for office in 10, 20 years. You got to remember that. It feeds into the next generation. Number 5. The Cold War was merely the natural posturing developed and used by the states which will inevitably be involved in the next great struggle. When we say Cold War, the term means, they were hostile towards each other, but they didn't directly fight. Fighting went on all the time in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It's still going on today. It's all about that same grand chessboard. It never stopped. The United States involved in Vietnam. The United States and the West getting involved in Korea. Russia getting involved in Afghanistan. It really doesn't make it, or Russia and the United States now getting involved in Syria. It doesn't make any difference. It's still war. Technology has progressed and deluded people into thinking that airstrikes no longer constitute acts of war. It's delusional, but okay, I'll concede the point and just ignore your own stupidity. The fact is this. Only those states with nuclear weapons and advanced militaries are going to be able to participate in the first place. Now, smaller non-nuclear states may spark the problem in the way that World War I was sparked by Austria, the Austrian Empire, which, powerful but declining power, not as technologically literate as, say, the British or the Germans were at the time. And the Serbs, I believe it is. Serbians or Bosnians, one of the Balkan states. I know it was Franz Ferdinand who was shot. It was some Black Hand member. I think they're Serbians, but they may have been Bosnians. Don't crucify me for forgetting which state was actually involved. I think it was Yugoslavia later anyway. But, not exactly the states that you would expect, not superpowers. The Austrian Empire was a regional power, yes, but superpower, no. They had to call the big boy Germans in when they got into it with the Russians. It doesn't matter, though, who causes it, because only the nuclear powers really are capable of ending it. One nuclear power will get involved in a proxy conflict. It will get involved directly in the proxy conflict. And the proxy conflict will involve an ally of another nuclear state that is significant enough for the other nuclear state to also get involved. The Cold War then escalates into a standoff. And I don't mean a Cuban Missile Crisis standoff where someone's outmaneuvered the other person but no shots have been fired. I mean, there is actual war going on, and now two nuclear powers are directly involved with a hot war. The fact that diplomacy has not moved past the First World War era, that very few attempts were made to create diplomatic bodies that both had teeth and which didn't obviously side with one power over another in very bitter and often multinational struggles, is what will eventually sink the world. Now, if it doesn't happen during this generational cycle, it'll probably happen during the next one, in which case my generation will have mostly passed away by then. Or it could happen in the meantime at any time due to a mistake. That's the other point. In the past, somebody accidentally fires the cannon in the 1700s. Does it cause a war? Probably not. If the cannonball hits anything at all, it kills one person. The other country says, "Oh, well, you should say sorry." Okay, we're sorry. Here's $100 in gold or something. Now, if you accidentally fire a shot and you're using the right weapon systems, you may have just destroyed an entire country. People don't appear to quite understand that. And the world is also getting more dangerous because of nuclear proliferation. Now, the North Koreans do not have a hydrogen bomb. I don't care what their state propaganda says. I don't care what fearmongers here say. I don't care what the Chinese say. They don't have a hydrogen bomb. They have atomic systems. They may eventually develop a hydrogen bomb, but if you want to know where the real threat lies, look at India and Pakistan, which constantly skirmish, by the way. They're both trying to develop multi-stage nuclear weapons and long-range missile systems, longer range than they have now. The Russians are continuously testing new missiles. We've gone back to missile testing too. The only thing we haven't, as a nuclear collective, already gone back to doing in the last half a decade, since the Cold War restarted, even though it never stopped, is detonating nuclear weapons above ground. I would not be surprised to see a tentative return to underground nuclear tests in one or more major nuclear powers within the next half a decade. And at that point, then you can say, oh, well, he correctly predicted this. But these are just 5 things to keep in mind. I know this is perhaps a little bit more deep and gloomy than some of my videos. But yeah, I'm telling you that there are big problems in this world. Most people have overlooked them because they want to conflate the post-USSR era as being its own era separate from the atomic era. That's the first mistake. As being more peaceful than the Cold War, that they term it, which is not true at all. In fact, it's getting far, far worse than the Cold War ever was. There are so many wars going on in the world right now that various nuclear states are already involved in, that I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a period of time since the First World War where more nations were directly attacking one another at the same time, or World War II, rather. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find such a period in time. And we just happen to be about due for the next end of this same 80-year cycle, which, should make people a little bit nervous. But yeah, that's about all. Peace out.